here we'll make some brief remarks on the rest of Exodus 1 through 18. When we come to the 10 plagues, you're familiar with the 10 plagues, so I don't need to go into that in much detail, other than to point out that it's at least possible that it's a natural/supernatural phenomena. For example, the water, turning the water into blood, could be algae that cause the water to turn reddish and poison the waters, so that the frogs come out. The frogs die, and gnats and flies breed on the carcasses, and then the gnats and flies spread disease to both cattle and people. So there's at least a possibility that there's a natural, supernatural sequence there. But in any case, there's a miracle of timing. The lesson from this is that God is sovereign. He can control the forces of nature. He can harden Pharaoh's heart at will. And he's even sovereign over the gods of Egypt. In Egyptian theology, Pharaoh was considered to be a god, the god Horus. In life, he becomes the god of the underworld, Osiris, and death. The Nile was considered a god, turned into blood. But all those so-called gods of Egypt, Pharaoh, the Nile, as well as the frog god Hecht, and the bull god Apis, and the cow god Hathor, and the sun god Re, were powerless before Yahweh. Now, the last of the plagues is the plague on the firstborn, and that leads us to the Passover. And I have a few things to say about the Passover and unleavened bread, the Feast of Unleavened Bread that follows. Again, it's related to the plague on the firstborn, in which all the firstborn in Egypt, both man and beast, would die, except for those that perform the Passover. The date would be on the 14th of Nisan. Nisan would be March, April in our calendar, more or less around Easter time, plus or minus a month. And they were to eat unleavened bread during the Passover and for 7 days following. Thus begins the new calendar for Israel as a new nation. It always begins in this month. At least in ancient times. It changes later. The ritual of the Passover originally involved a substitutionary sacrifice. The Passover lamb served as a substitute for the firstborn, and only an unblemished male would do. And this in itself inculcates the idea of substitutionary sacrifice. The animal would be slaughtered, and then blood of the lamb would be put on the door frame of the house, showing obedience to the command. And where God saw the blood, that household would be spared. God would, traditionally would pass over it in the judgment. Perhaps another interpretation would stand guard over it to protect it from the judgment. In either case, the household would be spared. Now, part of the symbolism of Passover, they were to eat bitter herbs, probably symbolizing how bitter their lives had been in Egypt. They were to eat unleavened bread. Not that there was anything wrong with leavened bread, per se, but it was a symbol here of haste. They didn't have time for the dough to rise. The New Testament makes yeast and leaven a symbol of sin, but there's no hint of that in Exodus 12 itself. It would only be for spiritual Israel. No foreigner was to eat of the Passover, since they were delivered from, since they were not delivered from Egypt generally. However, foreign slaves and foreign sojourners and aliens who were circumcised, thus indicating that they had converted to Israelite religion, could eat of the Passover. The purpose of the Passover was to remember God's salvation, that great act of deliverance from Egyptian servitude. which basically marked Israel's national birthday. You could say without the Passover, there would be no Israel. We should also point out that the Passover forms the basis for the Lord's Supper. The first Lord's Supper was said to be a Passover celebration. You'll read about that in Matthew 26 and Mark 14 and Luke 22. And in many ways, it continues to follow the Jewish customs of the Passover as they developed in the years after the first Passover. Luke, for example, mentions 2 of the 4 cups that came to be used in Jewish Passover celebrations called Seders by New Testament times. And in Luke 22:18, Jesus records the words, these words after blessing the cup, "I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." Well, this is an echo of the traditional Jewish prayer at Passover, where you pray over the cup, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Borei peri hagafen, blessed are you, O Lord, King of the world, creator of the fruit of the vine, echoing that language of fruit of the vine in his statement after blessing the cup. In other words, he prayed that traditional prayer. The difference, of course, is that the Passover lamb is replaced by Christ himself. And the deliverance celebrated is no longer from physical oppression in Egypt, but from sin. Paul calls Christ our Passover sacrifice, who was sacrificed for us, 1 Corinthians 5:7. John picks up on the language, just as no bone was to be broken for the Passover lamb, Exodus 12:46, so no bone of Jesus as the unblemished Passover lamb was broken when he was crucified. Again, John chapter 19:31 through 36. In other words, for Christians, Passover is in a sense celebrated by every Lord's Supper. Well, let me finish up Exodus 1 through 18 with some brief comments. They leave Egypt, and the exact route of the Exodus is something that's disputed. And it depends on exactly where Mount Sinai is. The traditional Mount Sinai is in the southern end of the Sinai Peninsula, and that's still the most likely location. However, proposals for somewhat farther northern sites have been made, and even sites over in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula have been suggested. The traditional site is the most likely one, but there's a whole debate on that. And that also relates to the crossing of the Red Sea. Literally, Red Sea means Sea of Reeds. And if you look at the present-day topography, the Red Sea doesn't come anywhere near Goshen, where they were leaving from and heading towards Sinai. And it would seem to go kind of out of their way to go way down south here to where they could cross the Red Sea. It's more likely that they cross some bitter lakes that, at least with storm surges, occasionally connected with the Red Sea. And these bitter lakes, which have since dried up, would be where they actually crossed over in this region on their way south to heading towards Egypt, heading towards Mount Sinai. And of course, you know the story of the drowning of Pharaoh's army and the song of Moses, which celebrates the victory, which Miriam, Moses' sister, plays a prominent role in singing, where interestingly she's called a prophetess. And they progress on to Sinai. God provides for them in the desert with manna, which in Hebrew means, what is it? They didn't know what it was. We don't know what it is either. He also provided for them with quail and water from a rock. He gave them victory over enemies. The Amalekites opposed them. And Moses lifts up his arms in prayer, and God in prayer gives them victory. There was a crisis of an excessive workload for Moses, and he met with his father-in-law Jethro, who advised him that he needed to appoint judges under him to do the judging of the less important cases, and he would only cover the most important ones. And that will bring us to Mount Sinai, and we'll continue with that story in the next presentation.